Welcome everyone to the third week of our Global Plant Forward Culinary Summit, the virtual edition. I'm Jacqueline Shee, the Director of Programs and Special Projects for the Strategic Initiatives Group at the Culinary Institute of America and Programs Co-Director for this virtual series, along with Anne McBride, who you may have seen in our first 2 weeks of the summit. If you joined us for week 1 or week 2, welcome back. And if this is the first time you are tuning in, wondering what you missed, don't worry. We posted all of the inspiring content on our website at plantforwardkitchen.org. That includes all of the presentations and recipes that you're going to see today, and the password to access these materials was in the email we sent to you earlier this week. Launching the virtual edition of what was supposed to be a memorable 3 days in the Napa Valley together has been no small feat. But we've been thrilled with the positive response we've gotten from you, our community. And it's been wonderful to have not only those of you who are originally going to be with us in person come back week after week, but also a number of you for whom this may be a first glimpse into the industry leadership and professional development education work we do here at the CIA. As we were developing the virtual version of our program content, we felt strongly that we needed to make it accessible to as many people in the industry as possible. Thanks to our program sponsors, we've been able to bring this virtual series to you tuition-free, and we're incredibly grateful for the support of our premium gold sponsor, Unilever Food Solutions, our gold sponsors, Google Food, the National Peanut Board, Nestle Professional, and Oatly, as well as our bronze corporate and media sponsors. We hope you'll get a chance to chat with them during the networking breaks and in their expo booths throughout the summit. In fact, one of the things we very consciously wanted to bring over from our in-person conferences was that feeling of connection and engagement, the casual run-ins and serendipitous conversations that you might have with another attendee by virtue of being in the same space over the course of 3 days. To that end, we're really pleased to be using the Hopin platform, which does just that, taking our Global Plant Forward Culinary Summit beyond just another webinar and giving you the opportunity to network with your peers and industry colleagues in real time. For the uninitiated, we'll go over those features in a little bit. And for those who are veterans of Hopin already, don't get too complacent, as the discussion table themes, as well as sponsors and engagement opportunities in the expo section change every week. We'll also be opening new poll questions throughout today's session over in the tab on your right side. In fact, our first poll is already up and running. It's a little warm-up quiz for our first presentation from Amanda Topper from Mintel. We're asking you, in which restaurant segment are meat substitutes growing the fastest? We're going to be checking on those results during our first presentation by Amanda, so be sure to mark your answer, and we'll see if this GPF audience is savvy and up to date with their Plant Forward facts and figures. Speaking of facts and figures, have you checked out our Plant Forward by the Numbers resource yet? Available for download on our website. If you have, you might know that, according to Data Central, plant-based is gaining its footing at chains, with plant-based meat introductions quadrupling in 2019 compared to the previous year. Okay, that doesn't actually give you the answer for Amanda's quiz in terms of which segment of chains are seeing the fastest growth of meat substitutes, but maybe it'll at least stir something in your brain. In week 1, we heard from leading chefs about how Plant Forward continues to have relevance, even as many of us confront a more immediate crisis in the coronavirus pandemic. We also virtually traveled through cuisines and techniques of the Mediterranean without having to get on a plane. In week 2, we took a very scientific look at umami, or the 808 baseline of the flavor orchestra, in the words of Ali Bazari, and learned strategies for highlighting value and building profitable operations and brand concepts around Plant Forward. This week, we're journeying from the depths of the consumer mind to the well-being of your teams, and grabbing some sandwiches along the way. To kick things off, I'd like to invite Amanda Topper, Associate Director of Food Service for Mintel, to the stage. Amanda has more than a decade of market research experience spanning industries including food service, food and drink, healthcare, travel, and hospitality. So really all of the most severely impacted industries these days. Welcome, Amanda.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jackie. And thank you all for joining me today, wherever you might be dialing in from. I'm really excited to share with you kind of the latest and greatest of Mintel's research on the plant-based consumer today. So if you're not familiar with Mintel, we are the global experts in what consumers want and why. And today I'm going to be sharing a little bit of that consumer data from our Mintel report. So Mintel reports really provide a 360 view of the food service category, as well as a few other categories. I'm also going to be sharing some data from our Menu Insights tool, which tracks menus from across the US. So we're able to pinpoint exactly what's trending on those US menus. So let's just give you kind of a sneak peek of our agenda for today. So we're going to start with a look at who that plant-based consumer is. And then we'll take a look at how plant-based ingredients and dishes are trending on menus. And then I'm just going to wrap up things really quickly with some key areas to keep in mind when you're thinking of adding more plant-based items to your menus. So let's kick off with who the plant-based consumer is. So you've probably heard a lot of discussion around people leading a vegan diet, but really the truth is here, and you can see it in the data, that vegans really represent a rather small percentage of the US population. But we see that 1 in 10 consumers eliminates meat from their diet, at least completely or somewhat. So those consumers are either vegetarian, pescatarian, or vegan, so 10% of consumers. But the vast majority of consumers identify as omnivores, meaning they're eating a little bit of everything, whether that's meat, dairy, and plant-based foods. But we can see that omnivores, represent the biggest area of opportunities when we're talking about appealing to plant-based consumers. But if we take those consumers and we combine them with these other consumers in these blue bars right here, we can see that this collective group eliminates meat to some extent. So 63% of consumers, almost 2/3 of consumers. So this is kind of our core audience here. And it's interesting to know that omnivores, flexitarians, vegetarians, and vegans, these tend to be younger consumers. So your Generation Z consumers, your millennial consumers. So this is really important, especially in the context of a growing population, knowing that there's a lot of room for growth for plant-based as these consumers really grow their spending power. And one of the biggest questions you're probably wondering about is, why are consumers eating plant-based proteins? So we've probably, heard this before. It's a lot of it's being driven by health. So 56% say they're eating it to be healthier. We also see that more than a quarter are trying to eat less meat, and a similar percentage is trying to eat more plant-based foods in general. Only about 1 in 5 consumers say they are eating these items to really manage their cholesterol. So that's a little bit of a secondary consideration there. But what's really great is that taste is also a relatively strong driver. So 42% say plant-based proteins taste good, and we know how important taste is to trial of new items. And a similar percentage say they're eating them to add variety to their diets. Some of those more secondary considerations are related to environment and ethical reasons. So we see that 16% eat them for lowering their impact on the environment, and this could just mean, lowering their carbon footprint. And 15% eat them to be more sustainable, or they feel like it's more sustainable than real meat. So what's really interesting, though, is when we look at the difference in motivations by diet type, so based on what types of diets consumers are following. So if we go to the next slide here, we can see that omnivores and flexitarians are more likely to point to health as a reason for eating these plant-based proteins. But vegetarians and vegans and those who follow a more specific diet, they're more likely to point to some of those animal ethics and environmental or sustainability reasons. And remember that those omnivores and flexitarians, those consumers tend to be younger, those Gen Zs and those millennials. So they really represent a much larger portion of the US population. So what this means is that health positioning is really going to be more likely to resonate with a broader consumer base. While some of those more philosophical considerations are going to matter a little bit more to your vegans, vegetarians, and pescatarians. So our recommendation is to always lead with health positioning and have the ethics and environmental reasons kind of be those secondary considerations. And while we saw earlier that health is a really strong purchase driver, we do also see other perceptual challenges that meat alternatives are still facing today. So this is showing you some data among consumers who don't eat plant-based alternatives. And the top reason is that they just simply prefer real meat. And this is especially the case for older consumers who tend to be set in their ways. They really enjoy eating traditional proteins. But we also see that more than a quarter don't feel that plant-based alternatives are as tasty. And again, we mentioned before, we know taste is really a key driver. And 1 in 5 dislikes the texture of meat substitutes, with a similar percentage of consumers also finding them to be too processed. And then finally, a quarter don't believe they're worth paying more for. So this is really interesting because this is a view that's really held across demographics. So regardless of age or gender or even household income. So what this means is that some of these more higher priced meat alternatives may suffer some losses, especially as consumers are starting to tighten their budgets amidst a looming recession. And even though we've definitely seen the strong growth and interest in plant-based foods, meat is still viewed by many consumers as the ideal protein source. So here you can see 63% of consumers agree that real meat is the best source of protein, and that's among all consumers. But it's probably no surprise that the majority of meat eaters also agree with this statement. But what's really interesting is that when you look at consumers who are eliminating meat or limiting meat in their diet, so talking about flexitarians, pescatarians, vegetarians, and vegans, almost half of them also agree with this statement. So that's pretty telling. So this is really highlighting an opportunity here to really improve the protein content and these perceptions of plant-based proteins. Some other really interesting data that we see as far as attitudes toward what types of plant-based protein items consumers want. We also see consumers are looking for variety. So they want something more than just those ubiquitous burgers that we've definitely seen across the market. We also want to see more diversity in terms of ingredients. So looking at sourcing more diverse ingredients can kind of attract a wider audience. And we've seen a lot of those leading meat alternative brands using soy, wheat, and pea protein, but we've also seen consumers showing interest in a wide variety of proteins. So proteins like lentils and fava beans and even nuts and seeds. And some of those major brands like Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat, they've achieved mainstream popularity with plant-based products that really closely mimic the taste and texture of real meat. But those alternatives tend to require a long list of ingredients that might be concerning to consumers who are looking for clean label. So 46% of consumers here say they'd eat more meat substitutes if they were less processed. And that's even higher among consumers who are avoiding or limiting their meat consumption. We also see here 44% of consumers agree that plant-based foods can provide all of the protein a person needs. And while agreement is higher among consumers who are avoiding meat, we still need more education to really reassure consumers that plant-based protein is not inferior to protein from real meat. And one of the kind of latest trends in this space has been the blended meat products. So it's a newer trend. We've seen a lot of this playing out in retail, especially from some of those major players like Tyson and Applegate Farms. But this is something that we expect to see more of in food service, really kind of give consumers the best of both worlds by adding vegetables and legumes to some of those real meat products. So now let's take a look at the types of protein sources that consumers say they prefer. And probably not surprisingly, the most preferred plant-based proteins are those that are really familiar to consumers and are those natural sources of protein. So things like beans and lentils and quinoa. We also see relatively high interest in soy and pea protein, and that's really been driven by the prevalence of some of those mainstream meat substitutes. But we also don't see much interest from consumers in proteins like seitan or algae, but we do see a little bit stronger interest among younger consumers, especially looking at millennials who have either tried those proteins or they're interested in trying them. So something to kind of keep in mind here is that US consumers have different perceptions or preferences that shift based on occasion. And for the most part, we're seeing that consumers are starting to recognize that meat made from plants is not automatically healthier for them. So you can see here, 54% of consumers prefer whole plant-based proteins, and this goes up to 61% of millennials. So sometimes consumers want to have a nice plant-forward dish that doesn't necessarily include some of those processed meat substitutes. But on the other hand of this, or on the other end of the spectrum, we see almost three-quarters of consumers prefer meat substitutes that mimic the taste and texture of real meat. So there is, this opportunity for consumers who want that real flavor and taste and texture of meat that they're used to. But kind of meeting in the middle, we see the best of both worlds. So just more than half of consumers are balancing health and indulgence when they're dining out. So there might be occasions where they want a plant-forward veggie grain bowl, for example, or other occasions where they might want an Impossible cheeseburger. So the key takeaway here being really it's important to give consumers options. And as we've seen a lot greater availability of plant-based foods, we're also starting to see greater consumption. So almost half of consumers say they eat plant-based meat substitutes more often than they did a year ago. And restaurants have really been a strong driver of that. So 24% say they often eat plant-based meat substitutes when they're dining out. And then finally, more than half of Americans agree that restaurants should offer more plant-based protein options. So as we've seen plants kind of become more realistic and really spreading across food service segments, consumers are really primed to expect really high quality, exciting plant-based options wherever they're choosing to dine. And just to kind of keep this in line with what's happening right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, just as of April, we've seen that meat packing plants have really become kind of a new hotspot for COVID-19 outbreaks. And we've seen a few of the major players in the meat industry having to temporarily close down their plants due to these outbreaks. So in response, we've seen retailers like Costco and Kroger and Albertsons having to set these meat purchase limits for consumers. And so as the meat industry is kind of going through these tough times, we feel that some consumers might start to incorporate some more of those plant-based proteins into their diets, especially if meat becomes more expensive or harder to find. And then we're seeing, brands kind of responding to this as well. So just earlier this month, we saw Impossible Burger rolling out at 1,700 Kroger stores, and Beyond Meat has said they are offering value packs and discounts as we're seeing more issues with the beef supply. So now we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and take a look at how meat substitutes and other plant-based proteins are trending on US menus. So I thought it would be interesting to look at when we started to see meat substitutes really growing rapidly on menus. So I pulled some data from our Menu Insights database that really looks at menus from across the US. So we've seen 41% growth in meat substitutes from 2015 to 2020. And when we're talking about meat substitutes, that's going to include anything from tofu, tempeh, seitan, and soy, as well as some of those more mainstream processed meat substitutes. And this first circle here is kind of when we first started to see an uptick in mentions in 2017. And this happened just after the Impossible Burger was launched on restaurant menus. And interestingly enough, the restaurant in New York, Momofuku Nishi, was the first restaurant to menu the Impossible Burger. And you've probably seen in the news that they actually just closed down a few weeks ago due to the pandemic. But over the last year or so, we've seen some of those next generation meat substitutes really growing. So Impossible Burger, Beyond Burger, and they're really growing fast. But we're also seeing things like the Black Bean Burger continuing to grow. So what this means is that diners are still interested in seeing some of those vegetarian menu standbys along with some of those newer innovations. All right, so let's take a look at this poll now and see if you haven't already. Let's put in your responses. Give you just a second here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share the response. Looks like most of you has said that the QSR segment is driving or is growing the fastest in terms of meat substitutes. And you are correct. Very smart audience we have here. So what's really interesting to know is that meat substitutes are actually growing across all US restaurant segments. But most of the mentions of meat substitutes are on casual dining and fast casual menus, but the majority of the growth is being driven by the QSR segment. So it's almost like those other segments are kind of playing catch up a little bit. And this probably isn't a surprise to you, as we've seen a lot of launches, at least before the pandemic, from a variety of different QSR chains, including Burger King and Carl's Jr., especially as we saw more interest in things like the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Burger. So we definitely have seen a very strong uptick in mentions at fast food. And what's interesting to know is that consumers are more likely to try plant-based foods if they're in familiar formats. We kind of tend to be risk adverse, so presenting new ingredients in familiar formats tend to be the best way to go. So you can see here, these are the fastest growing dishes with meat substitutes. And we're seeing things like pizza, burritos, burgers, tacos, really familiar foods to consumers. And this is especially relevant now as consumers are kind of gravitating toward more comfort foods during the pandemic. But I think as consumers are kind of transitioning away from stay-at-home mandates, they're going to want foods that make them feel better and are a little bit more health forward. So that's where I think plant-based dishes that have a little bit of that comfort food edge to them can kind of help them achieve that nice balance and really cast a wide net in terms of consumer response. All right, so I know we have about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to kind of cruise through these other data points here. But what was really interesting to see is that some of the fastest growing claims on menus are those related to house and house made. So we really see some strong opportunity for promoting proprietary menu items with some of these claims. And I think this will be increasingly important as more and more operators kind of menu those same plant-based proteins or meat substitutes. So these types of preparations or flavors or seasonings can really help them stand out from the competition. So lastly, I just wanted to show you some really interesting plant-based ingredients on the menu. The first is an amaranth custard. So it has amaranth in the base as well as on top with a puffed amaranth for a nice crunch there. I like this middle example because they're kind of taking a fun version of a banh mi sandwich and turning it into a taco. And this one's using edamame pate and lemongrass tofu as that plant-based protein. And then finally, we've seen this hearts of palm and pulled jackfruit carnitas tacos out of New York. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, we had started to see consumers kind of questioning the long ingredients and the processed nature of meat substitutes. So we're definitely seeing more vegetable-focused dishes that use some fun and exciting preparations. And a few here I really wanted to call out. The first being a take on a steak. So this is a cauliflower steak, and I've actually tried this myself. It's delicious, and it's served with the same preparation, the same sides as their traditional steak. So they're kind of giving the same TLC to that dish. Noma, of course, needs no introduction, but they have a celery root shawarma. So again, kind of a trendy dish with that veggie focus there, and one that we've seen kind of replicated at other restaurants globally. And then Duck's Eatery, which became famous for their watermelon ham. They also have a smoked cantaloupe burger, which is cured, smoked, and baked. And then finally, as I mentioned, we had seen growth of homemade and house-made claims. So I just wanted to call attention to a few major players, major chains across the country that are doing that firsthand. So either using their own ingredients to form their own patties, like this mushroom quinoa patty, or adding their own spices and seasonings to meat crumbles or Impossible Foods. All right, so real quick, let's just wrap up with 3 key areas to keep in mind when you're adding plant-based items to your menus. Can we go to the next slide? All right. So first takeaway, make sure you're creating room for both health and indulgence. So diners are really attracted to plant-based items for those health benefits. We saw that was a huge driver, but they also like to indulge when dining out. So make sure to kind of find room on the menu for both healthy and indulgent items to really make sure you're appealing to all consumers based on whatever those dietary and flavor preferences might be. Draw on whole foods. So consumers might not understand some of those long ingredient lists that we've seen on some of these products, but they know what quinoa is, or sweet potatoes, or beans. So really kind of go back to basics and use those ingredients to create something that's really interesting, but also familiar to consumers. And that can be achieved with some interesting flavor profiles and LTOs. And then finally, differentiate with original ideas. So we know that offering those mainstream items is going to really appease consumers, but if you create proprietary items, it's really going to bring consumers back to your operation, because it's going to be something that people can't really get from anywhere else. So with that, thank you so much for your time, and I will be sticking around for a little bit for questions, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I always find all of these numbers and all of the research going on into the consumer mind so fascinating. We do have a couple of questions already for you, and just a reminder also for everyone out there that, again, Amanda is going to be joining us for a little bit more of an extended Q&A following our next presenter, Zach Weston, but we do have a couple of minutes for questions right now. So Andrea wants to know if you think plant-based meat alternatives are getting more press right now versus legumes or other whole plant-based protein options because of marketing. Do you think you sort of spoke to some people are resisting the long ingredient lists now, but there's still a huge growth. What do you think it is that has people go towards those sort of branded items versus the whole ingredients?
Sure, that's a great question. I think it comes down to availability. So we've seen so much mainstream availability of some of those plant-based proteins, especially in the fast food space, which we saw is growing the fastest. So I think these are options that are widely available and consumers are curious about them. So that might be the initial trial for a consumer just based on the novelty and the availability. I think that over time that's going to change, and we're starting to see that now. I think more so in the fine dining space, as chefs are getting a little bit more creative with some of those whole plant-based ingredients. I think that will shift over time, but in terms of where the trend is now, it's really based on that availability.
Great, thank you. We've got another question from Matt, who says he's curious if the Omnivore Group has thoughts regarding the GMO status of meat substitutes and whether it's important to pay a little bit extra for this. I'm not sure if he means paying extra to know about GMO or for it to be GMO free, but do you have any, I know you didn't speak to GMO in your research, but do you have any additional insights into sort of how that plays into the conversation?
Sure. So in terms of if consumers are willing to pay more, the answer is no, they're not willing to pay more. The other thing that's interesting is we have seen the rise of GMO free with some of these meat substitutes on menus. But for the most part, if we're talking about those omnivore consumers, they're not necessarily looking for GMO-free claims with plant-based proteins, but it's really something that's being driven more so with consumers who have more of the restricted diet. So I think in general, that larger consumer isn't always looking specifically for GMO-free when they are choosing plant-based options.
Great, thank you. We've got just 1 minute left, so I've got one more question for you coming from Eric. Maybe Zach can speak to this a little bit later on as well, but Eric asked, how does each category of plant-based consumers spend on food? For instance, vegans are a much smaller portion of consumers, but if they spend or are willing to spend more on their meals, they could be a valuable target.
That's a great question. So I don't have any data specific to spending. I will say that vegans, vegetarians, pescatarians, that those consumers are very loyal. So while they are a very small subset of the consumer population, they're very loyal. So they are perhaps spending more frequently. But that being said, we know that targeting a larger group of consumers is going to be achieved with looking at those omnivore consumers.
Indeed. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Amanda. Again, we'll see you in a little bit. We'll bring Amanda back for more Q&A in just a bit. But now we're going to go to our next presenter, Zach Weston, who is the Food Service and Supply Chain Manager for the Good Food Institute, an international nonprofit focused on creating a healthy, just, and sustainable food system through plant-based protein innovation and cellular agriculture. Hi, Zach.
Hi, Jackie. Thank you so much for giving us the chance to talk about this today.
Absolutely. We're so glad to have you. You can probably see also by the questions coming in that people are very interested in this category. Just a reminder again for everybody that we're going to have Q&A with both Zach and Amanda together following Zach's presentation. So feel free to put your questions in the chat on the right-hand side. And with that, I know you've got a lot of data to get through as well, Zach, so I'll let you take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jackie. Well, hello to everyone. Very excited to be talking a little bit about where plant-based has been over the past year or so, and then spend a little bit of time talking about how those lessons can apply to marketing your plant-based and plant-forward dishes. And then we'll wrap up with a few thoughts from the Good Food Institute on where we think the plant-based and plant-forward category is going over the rest of 2020 and beyond. So we're going to start off first by looking at some trend numbers, and this is going to be a little bit more focused on the market sales data side of the plant-based trend. What we do know at a high level is that 2019 was an amazing year for plant-based. It certainly got a lot of attention, but underlying all that attention hype were some very real sales numbers. So NPD reported in the middle of the year in July that plant-based burgers enjoyed a 3.4% percentage market share in US fast food restaurants, which is fairly impressive for a category that barely existed a couple of years ago. Data Central reported an enormous amount of growth in the terminology plant-based appearing on US restaurant menus. And the group purchasing organization, the Dining Alliance, noted that its members purchased a very strong, over 250% more meat alternatives in 2019 than they did for the similar period in 2018. So a very, very strong year from a variety of metrics. The next piece of data I wanted to share comes from NPD Supply Track Service. So this is just looking at broadline food service distribution and specifically the sales that broadline distributors make directly to operators. These represent wholesale prices, and this is also representative of most of the broadline universe. So it's covering probably around 40% of total food service sales in the United States, so not quite everything. And it does exclude large chains over 250 units, and is going to be skewed towards more of the smaller chains and non-commercial food service operators. But what we've seen from this data, again, is very, very strong growth for 2019, growth of 37% from 2018 to 2019 in terms of dollar sales, and 21% growth in terms of volume. Very, very impressive numbers, and indicative of a strong year behind a lot of the news stories. This part of the NPD report was also interesting, and I think it really underscores the point that Amanda was making earlier, that this trend is really being driven by omnivores and flexitarians primarily. There just aren't enough vegans and vegetarians to drive these kinds of numbers. So according to NPD's research, the consumers who are ordering plant-based the most frequently, the plant-based meat products, are on their other trips or other dining occasions ordering exactly what you would expect a typical diner to order: beef burgers, chicken. They're going to have something with pork in it one night and something with plant protein in it the next day. So this is really being driven by folks who are trying to have a diversity of proteins and not just exclusively relying on plant sources. Another really interesting outcome of the research that we worked with NPD on was that plant-based is doing the strongest, particularly burgers are doing the strongest in the exact same segments that burgers do well from traditional like animal sources. So if you are a burger concept or any sort of concept that's offering a typical type of animal meat item, chances are good that a plant-based version of that will do very well. I don't have time to go too deep into the report. There were a lot of really interesting insights, and I'd be more than happy to share the report with you if you'd like to email me or contact me through the event app afterwards. But a few other things that are worth highlighting are the fact that plant-based burgers specifically are displacing multiple types of animal proteins. So it's not just a one-for-one replacing beef. A lot of consumers replace their chicken consumption with plant-based burgers. They'll replace their pork consumption, their turkey consumption. It's drawing from a wide variety of sources, including in some cases displacing other types of vegetable proteins. The other, I think, really important thing to note that's going on is that a lot of consumers are moving, a lot of the excitement and growth is moving beyond the burger. So while burgers certainly get a lot of attention, the fastest growing formats are things like meatballs, fillets, any type of sausage product. Those are the ones that are growing the quickest. And a lot of really other additional insights in that report that I'd be happy to share later. What was also noteworthy about 2019 in plant-based was there were a lot of significant launches, and probably none more noteworthy than Burger King's launch of the Impossible Whopper. And it performed extraordinarily well for them. According to research we've uncovered from that launch and subsequent national rollout, the Impossible Whopper had raised check average prices. It brought in new consumers. They cited it specifically as one of the biggest drivers behind very strong comparable sales growth numbers. And additionally, it managed within a very short period of time to grab significant market share, almost 10% of all Whoppers sold on average in the average Burger King unit. Burgers weren't the only area, though, where there were significant launches. Right at the tail end of 2019, we saw Dunkin' in the breakfast category launch a Beyond Meat breakfast sandwich. This, of course, had very similar results to what Burger King experienced. It brought in new customers, it helped with same-store sales growth, and it also increased average check size. So a really powerful benefit for them as well. And these benefits weren't just confined to products that are replacing meat, plant-based meats, and nor was it confined just to large chains. Gregory's Coffee, a relatively small to medium-sized coffee and breakfast chain, found when they introduced the Just Egg that it grabbed a very significant, with 40% market share of their plant-based sandwich category. It again brought in new customers. It didn't cannibalize from existing sales, and it ended up also helping to raise check averages. So all obviously important metrics for profitability of new launches. The growth also isn't just confined to food service. We also saw on the retail side through the grocery store channel that plant-based sales grew year over year through the end of 2019, 11%, which is very strong and ended up being about 5 times faster than growth for all total food sales during that same period. We also saw, what was really exciting, a very strong amount of growth in the grocery channels where trends start. So specifically the specialty gourmet channel and natural channel. Those are typically where you see trends, the signal of trends that are coming down the pipe in the future. And what we see there is that while plant-based meat in the conventional, like Walmart's and Kroger's in the United States, that mainstream grocery, plant-based meat has about a 1% market share there. In the natural, more specialty channels, it has an 8% market share. Plant-based milk is even more impressive. Plant-based milk has about a 13% market share in the United States in mainstream grocery, but at the natural channel, it has a market share of 40%, which is fairly impressive. Almost 4 out of 10 milk products sold are from plant-based sources like almonds, soy, etc. Another thing we track very closely is understanding the repeat buying rate, because we want to know, is this a passing fad, or is this something that represents a long-term shift in consumer behavior? And what we have seen is that this seems to represent a very long-term shift. There seems to be a significant amount of loyalty being built in. So in the past year, both the repeat purchase rate, the number of times buyers would purchase plant-based meat products repeatedly, as well as the buy rate, how much they would buy when they made a purchase, increased slightly. And in the case of the repeat rate was over 60%, which is very significant for the CPG category. So next we're going to jump into a study that the Good Food Institute conducted with a company called MindLab, looking at the attributes that consumers are looking for in dishes that have plant-based meat in them. What was interesting about this study is it looked at both explicit interest from consumers, which is what consumers say when you ask them in a survey what they're interested in. And it also detailed what consumers were implicitly interested in. It correlated different product attributes with what consumers, with the different products that consumers voted they would be most likely to eat. So it's an interesting comparison because you get what people say as well as what people actually want. And no surprise, of course, taste ends up on top as part, and of course should be on top of our messaging hierarchy around plant-based and plant-forward foods. But there were also some interesting revelations about other things that were important to consumers, like freshness and familiarity and comfort. And Amanda alluded to this a little bit, but familiarity and tradition seem to be very powerful drivers. So foods that are comfortable, that are easily understandable, really seem to resonate with consumers. So there is a lot of novelty and there's a lot of fun new things. Making stuff with plant protein is kind of a new twist on maybe old classics, but keeping that familiar preparation, that familiar messaging, maybe a familiar format is really key to make sure consumers aren't put off by all the newness. The other thing that was really interesting from the research was that consumers really did say that health is an incredibly important motivator. It's a very important aspirational driver of plant-based meat consumption. But when it gets right down to that purchase decision, there are other things that we definitely want to emphasize higher, things like taste perhaps, or familiarity. So it is important to keep health as part of your messaging for sure, but you definitely want to scream flavor and whisper health. You want flavor and other things to be more primary in your message hierarchy. If you are going to be talking specifically about health, we did find as part of this research that making positive claims tends to be better than making negative claims. So saying a product has lots of fiber or lots of protein tends to be a lot better than saying it's low fat or low sugar. For reasons that probably are obvious to us, it sort of sounds like it's low flavor as well. A lot of really important lessons, I think, fall out of this research, as well as some of the best practices from the success stories we saw in 2019. I'll just point out a few ones that will complement a lot of what Amanda said earlier. The first thing is that plant-based, plant-forward really needs to fit in well with your brand, your menu, and your operations. We've seen most major launches succeed in food service, but we've seen some notable failures, such as Tim Hortons in Canada. And what really went wrong at Tim Hortons and what we've seen in other places is if it isn't what your customers expect from your brand and it doesn't really fit with your menu, it's not going to be something they gravitate towards. And of course, if it doesn't work in the back of the house, or it's extremely costly to produce, or just in some way is not a good fit with your cooking equipment, that creates a lot of hassles that just end up meaning that the launch isn't going to work. So it has to make holistic sense for your entire operation, front and back of the house. The other thing that's extremely important to consumers is emphasizing the protein. Amanda talked about how a lot of consumers have a very strong association between protein and things like animal meat. And there's good reason for that. It feels like very concentrated, hefty protein to us. It really anchors that center of plate. So for consumers, helping to emphasize to them that plants have protein, that this is going to be just as satisfying, just as satiating as a different dish that maybe has animal meat as more of the star, is incredibly important to drive that interest and purchase intent. Really useful for marketing. Another thing that's interesting is that while certainly a lot of plant-based dishes and plant-forward dishes can be created even cheaper than some of the animal dishes they're replicating, a lot of the buzzier ingredients and products out there on the market today do come at a price premium. And while this is certainly something companies are working on and prices will come down as this industry starts to experience economies of scale, we have seen that consumers have been willing to accept a small price premium where warranted with a lot of the major launches that have happened over the past couple of years and stayed on menu. So it is the case that you can pass it on to your consumers, but obviously, of course, a lot of consumers are not going to accept that. So it does limit the appeal. It can work, but whenever possible, try to achieve something close to price parity. Another really important lesson that emerged from last year was the importance of leveraging that core brand equity and using strong images. And the importance of this makes sense. You use images and your branding to communicate that this is going to be a flavorful, familiar experience, and that whatever plant-based or plant-forward dish you have is going to give your consumers the exact same experience they've come to expect from your operation, whatever that happens to be, your unique spin on it. And we saw Burger King do very well with this And it seems to be a hallmark of success for good marketing and promotional materials that we've seen from a lot of the major launches. The next thing I'll point out again is that vegan and vegetarian language is often very divisive. It can work in some contexts, to be sure. It certainly is a lot more popular, say, with younger generations if you have a lot of millennials or Gen Zs that you're serving. But for general population, this study from Morning Consult found that vegans scored dead last in terms of positive effect among general consumers in the universe of these different food terms. So use caution with it. It can work, but in general, our advice is instead to use more plant-centric language. From the MindLab study here again, we found plant-based scored really well, saying things like 100% plants, made with plants, plant-powered, all seem to resonate a lot with consumers. So we definitely recommend that terminology if at all possible. I'll just skip on to the next slide here. This is just a quick overview. I think the real summary here is just that when you're thinking about marketing plant-based dishes, make flavor the plant primary message, avoid off-putting terms, keep it in the same section of your menu as your other dishes so that consumers know what to expect, and recognize that a lot of the marketing principles like strong images and good brand fit that apply to animal meat or animal products also apply to plant-based. It's not entirely a new thing when it comes to marketing. Next, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to walk through some of the things we anticipate going forward for the plant-based and plant-forward category. The first thing I'll note here is, as I talked to earlier, we do think this has a lot of long-term staying power. The repeat buying rate is really high. We see a lot of motivations for people coming into this category. Some come in for health, some come in for taste, some come in for animal welfare, some for the environment. There's a diversity of reasons, and that helps give the category long-term staying power. We've also seen it expand to a variety of product formats. We're seeing growth in all kinds of different segments, Mexican, Italian, et cetera. And of course, we see the younger generations really, really gravitating towards this. Although plant-based does have pretty broad demographic appeal, it's absolutely off the charts for younger Gen Z and millennials, which is bodes very well, of course, for the future of any product category to have buy-in from a younger generation that is continually aging into more purchasing power. There's a lot of reasons to have plant proteins on the menu. We think it helps drive sales, as we alluded to. It raises the check average, it brings in new consumers, it removes the veto vote situation if you have a vegan or vegetarian or dining party. But one other thing operationally I wanted to underline is that it gives you a platform for culinary creativity. A lot of the examples that Amanda shared being really cogent exemplars of that. And one of the things that's important is the versatility. When you add one SKU of plant-based beef to your menu, it's just like adding animal beef. You can do soups with that. You can do burritos. You can do pizza. Adding just one single additional storage SKU gives you a huge platform for creativity that can impact almost all of your dishes across a lot of different categories. One of the things we see going forward, or we predict going into this next year, the rest of 2020 and beyond, is that this is really going to expand beyond the burger. So we've seen burgers, and we still think there's a lot of growth happening there, but we're increasingly seeing plant-based moving into different ethnic cuisines, moving into different day parts. We're seeing a lot of growth in breakfast. We're seeing a ton of growth, pizza toppings, Mexican, moving into a lot of different Italian, like pasta toppings, that sort of thing. We also anticipate that as the technology continues to keep evolving, we're going to see a lot of new products like chicken nuggets and different types of dairy products. An additional consideration is that we expect operators to keep formulating with more plant-based ingredients in mind. It actually matters if you are reaching 99% of consumers instead of just 97%, because at the end of the day, even some small percentage of people who are vegan or who have allergies to your product, at the end of the day, that affects your sales. And so if there is a truly product that's at parity in terms of price, taste, functionality, that's something that probably makes sense to just stock one version of that product that appeals to 99% of people versus two versions of that product, with one of them, maybe the animal-based version, only appealing to less than 90%. So something we expect to see, sort of not necessarily for marketing reasons, but just sort of incidentally. I'll probably wrap things up here shortly, just ending on, I think what this is a pretty good note to end on here is that this is a fairly young category. We're seeing a lot of innovation, certainly from a culinary perspective, where we're rediscovering old flavors, rediscovering the use of plants at the center of the plate, borrowing from a lot of amazing culinary traditions to move plants more into the mainstream. And some of that is sort of rediscovery. But a lot of this is also being driven by new discoveries, by food technologies that are haven't as been as prominent before. So we fully expect that as this technology keeps developing, that we're going to see products that are able to be much more minimally processed and still have the same flavor and texture profiles of a lot of the most popular products today. We fully expect that as those product qualities go up, particularly as we're able to breed crops that are specifically optimized for plant-based meats, we're going to see the cleaner labels, we're going to see a higher quality product, but we're also going to see lower prices as those costs come down and economies of scale start kicking in. So while there is a lot of really exciting culinary innovation to be had, there's also a lot of really exciting sort of food technology innovation we're seeing. And I think that's going to keep driving a lot of the growth in this category as it expands into other day parts and other categories. So with that, I'm going to end there. And I think we'll hit back to Jackie for some Q&A.
Hey, Zach, thank you so much. I have to say that my brain, I feel like between the content that you, and thanks for joining us again, Amanda, the content that both of you are bringing, trying to keep track of the various things that play in the consumer mind. We want things that are traditional, but we also want things that are novel. We want things that are comfort food and give us a sense of indulgence, but we're also watching our health, and we want to make sure that we're not going too far into things. Your expertise and your ability to parse out some of these elements and break them down is so great. So thank you so much for doing that for us. I can tell that everyone else in the audience has the same kind of interest and wonder that I do, because we've got tons of questions coming in for both of you. Zach, several people are bringing up the question, and Amanda sort of alluded to it in her presentation as well, this sort of concern around processing of plant-based products, plant-based meats, meat alternatives. Can you speak to that in terms of, and I liked what you said also about sort of the technology evolving, because I think that we often on the consumer end of it sort of see, just the ingredients list and kind of make judgments on that, as opposed to thinking about the way that technology has evolved to get greater efficiencies out of, what our whole ingredients in the beginning. So I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit, and also sort of what you are seeing in your general work in terms of addressing people's concern around that.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I think there's definitely room in the market for all kinds of products, right? A lot of the products we eat are processing, and in a lot of ways, food processing is, a modern miracle that aids in preservation. It does come with some downsides, however, and it's extremely important to acknowledge that a lot of the innovators, both at plant-based meat companies as well as the companies that supply them, are working to find better solutions for creating some of those flavors and textures and all of the experiences that consumers want. But in a way that offers a cleaner label, a experience that consumers are really comfortable with. And as I alluded to, I think that particularly as we optimize the ingredients, that helps us to bring prices down, yes, and it helps us to make it taste a little bit better. But the also underappreciated benefit is that it really makes labels cleaner. A good example is a company recently released a new soybean variety that has such a high protein content that you don't need to make it into an isolate or a concentrate. You can just put it directly into the product, listed on the label as soybeans, and it has low enough taste and sort of like color properties that you're able to just use it one for one, where you typically have used concentrate or isolate before. So innovation like that on the back end that, yes, isn't necessarily as accessible to consumers, is going to improve the sustainability of these products, improve that taste, but it's also going to have that benefit of, we don't need a long ingredient list to modulate flavor if we've bred crops specifically for this flavor. So there's a very bright future for that processing question, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Great. Amanda, I wonder too, you mentioned, some of these consumers who can be wary of that long ingredient list and looking for sort of proprietary things. Have you been able to sort of parse out specifically what it is about that long ingredient list that turns people off, or what is kind of driving that wariness around it?
Sure. I think it comes back to consumers not recognizing some of the ingredients in those lists. So I mentioned that I think moving forward, we'll see more operators and chefs work with some of those ingredients that are familiar And we're seeing those grow on menus. So beans, quinoa, other types of grains that consumers know. They know what they are, they know what to expect. And so it's just a matter of kind of repositioning these items and these ingredients in a way that is a little bit different for them, because I think we keep hitting at it over and over again, is that consumers are really looking for something that's a little bit familiar to them when they are looking to try plant-based options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, both of you spoke to that in terms of the burger, right? And the way that the burger has been a really easy way for people to try some of these plant-based substitutes, meat substitutes. I wrote a note for myself in the way that certain items have sort of transcended their cuisines. Tacos are not so much seen as Mexican food anymore. They're just seen as tacos, a thing. It's almost like burgers have become disassociated with beef burgers. And we sort of have a trajectory for that, seeing turkey burgers, seeing fish burgers, that kind of thing. But it's almost like people have divorced that from the sense of, a beef-based burger, and just sort of what can you put into this form, which, as you said, I think gives a lot of room for innovation around plant-based substitutes. We have, speaking of, going back to beef a little bit, we've got Alejandro's asking about the benefits of the protein flip. And I wonder, Amanda, if you could sort of speak to this. Keeping meat as an optional garnish. We talked about, some of these plant-based substitutes. You mentioned also the blend and the way that certain companies are kind of using these whole products and mixing it with meat. What is that kind of appetite, and how are consumers looking for retaining just a little bit still of that animal-based protein?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting trend. In food service, we're seeing it play out, especially, I would say, in the fast casual space. And it's really well positioned for fast casual dining because you have so much flexibility as far as customizing your dish. So I've seen a few operators that have, a side option for protein, but by default, salads and other bowls come without protein. I think that's such a great way to execute that. But I think that it's something we'll see more of. And I think it's just a matter of communicating and repositioning in the consumer mindset that, maybe they want to choose something that's a little bit more plant forward and have that option on the side for meat. But I think it's also kind of a stepping stone. Some of those more retail products we've talked about from Tyson and Applegate Farms, I do expect to see more of those in food service because they, again, are familiar to consumers and they're just peppering in a little bit of that other plant-based protein. So it's positioned in a way that's really approachable for diners.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of retail, we've got a question, Zach, I wonder if you can speak to this. Matthew is asking, does the texture on plant-based meat alternatives seem like a barrier to retail? I know that there is sort of this difference in terms of what you as a consumer are anticipating managing in your home kitchen versus what a professional chef and maybe has resources to additional education from some of these purveyors in terms of preparing it. How do you see that playing out in the retail space?
Yeah, absolutely. Texture is pretty frequently cited as one of the biggest organoleptic barriers that consumers have to these products, or reasons why they wouldn't want to necessarily purchase them again. So there's a lot of work in that space. One of the things I'm most excited about is the advent of a lot of fermentation technologies, particularly utilizing things like algae or fungi to provide a different sort of texture solution for a lot of plant-based products. I think that'll be a really positive enabling technology. And then another really important research focus is that, even once you've nailed the flavor and the texture and everything, is how do I cook this? Does it cook the exact same way as an animal product that I'm already used to? Is it a little bit different? And that matters at home and it matters in your food service operation. So a lot of the cooking cues are things that, a lot of both flavor companies and ingredient companies, as well as these manufacturers of the end plant-based products are working on, because they know that cooking process, everything from the sound to the color to the just the way it looks as it changes shape as you heat it up or as you do whatever processing you need to it, is very important to help people understand when it's done, how to make sure it's maximally flavorful. So that is has gotten a lot more attention lately than it has in the past. And I think, again, we're going to see that cycle of innovation continue, and that's one of the areas of focus for a lot of companies in this space.
Awesome. Thanks for that little projection into the future. And that's actually where we're going to need to wrap it up. So thank you again, Zach Weston and Amanda Topper, for sharing this great information. I know that it was a lot of data that we threw out at you. So don't worry, the presentations are going to be posted on the website and you can access those and go back to them and consult them. So now we are going into a networking break sponsored by Oatly and Morningstar Farms. Hopefully you got a chance to make the Morningstar Farms chorizo pasilla taco, as I mentioned tacos earlier on, and the Oatly frozen dessert so that we can virtually share a snack, even though we aren't all together. As I mentioned before, we've got a range of ways for you to engage with everyone who's also attending today, from your peers and suppliers to presenters. For instance, there are themed discussion tables, which you can access via the Sessions tab on the left of your screen. And you can join the conversation with your audio and video or with the text chat. They run for the whole break, so feel free to pop in and pop out at your convenience. Some of you may be looking for more direct connections, in which case you should check out our networking feature, which randomly matches you with another attendee for a 4-minute chat. So commitment phobics, no need to worry. Think of it as hello, what brings you to GCF today? Conversation you might strike up at the coffee station at Copia. We're just doing it virtually instead. You can also visit the booths of our great sponsors who are making it possible to offer this virtual series tuition-free. Last week, a number of you indicated that you were looking to bring new products into your operation right away. And I know our sponsors would love to get your feedback on the products they're working on. So take a moment to visit the expo section and say hello. And in case you need just a bit more incentive, don't forget that participating in any of these activities enters you into a raffle to win great prizes like books from our presenters and registration to next year's conference. Those who participate all 5 weeks have a chance to win free registration and travel to next year's conference in Napa. Last week's winners, congratulations to last week's winners. We had a teaching kitchen chef from Bon Appetit at Google join us, and they won the free conference registration. The owner of Flavors of El Mundo won Ali Bazari's book, and Todd Geary won Abra Behrens' book. We also have a new poll open for you, so click away on the right-hand side. Given all of the insights you've now heard from Amanda and Zach around what's driving the growth of Plant Forward, we'd love to know what is driving you and your business to look into more Plant Forward options. Let us know what your primary objective is in bringing more innovation to your menu, and we'll check on those results a little later on. So go, enjoy the break, and we'll continue here on the stage in 20 minutes with Grab and Go Innovation with chefs Bill Billenstein and Richard Landau.